Good evening, everybody. As you may be aware, India International Center has started a lecture series on healthcare in India. In that series, we have so far had 5 lectures delivered by various eminent doctors. Today we are going to have the 6th lecture in that series. The objective of the series is, the series focuses on educating and informing society on advanced healthcare systems and its availability for the people. Healthcare has become one of India's largest sector, both in terms of revenue and employment. The Indian healthcare sector is growing at a brisk pace due to its strengthening coverage, service and increasing expenditure by public as well as private players. The first talk in this series was delivered by Dr. Devi Shetty, Chairman of Narayana Hospitals, on 16th February this year. He spoke on healthcare to drive Indian economy. The second talk was by Dr. V.K. Paul, member Niti Aayog. That was in March 2019. He spoke on regulatory reforms for meeting India's needs for human resources in healthcare. The third one was by Mrs. Preeti Sudan, Secretary in the Ministry of Health, Government of India. In April, she spoke on promotive and preventive health services for creating a healthy society. The fourth talk was by Professor K. Srinath Reddy. He spoke on, that was in the month of May, he spoke on enhancing the role of non-physician healthcare providers. And as you may be aware, Dr. Srinath Reddy is the real anchor of this program and real driving force behind it. The fifth talk was by Dr. D. Prabhakaran. He spoke on 4th June. The topic was meeting the challenge of non-communicable disease in India from prevention to palliative care. Today we are fortunate to have amidst us Dr. Vikram Patel, who is going to speak to us on how can we stop India's youth from killing themselves. Friends, I would like to make a brief introduction of Dr. Patel before I invite him to deliver his talk. Dr. Patel is a professor of global health and social medicine at Harvard Medical School. He is a psychiatrist whose work over the past 2 decades has focused on reducing the treatment gap for mental disorders in low resources countries. His work has addressed 4 major themes. They are: number 1, generating policy relevant evidence on the burden and impact of mental disorder. Second, developing and evaluating mental health interventions for delivery by non-specialist and lay health workers. The third, developing training programs to build research capacity and leadership in global mental health. And the fourth, communicating research to diverse audiences to act on this evidence. Dr. Patel has made significant contribution to science. Some of these areas are evidence of the burden of mental health problems in low and middle income countries, which have been the foundation for advocacy and why action is needed to address these problems. Evidence on effectiveness of task-carrying psychological interventions, which have been the foundation for demonstrating how action can be taken to address mental disorders in low resource settings. The third, designing the methodology for developing of scalable psychological treatments which can be delivered by non-specialist workers in routine healthcare settings for culturally diverse populations. Fourth is demonstrating the great paucity and inequitable distribution of global mental health research resources and outputs and setting the research agenda for global mental health. The fifth one is synthesis of research in global mental health for effective communication and uptake by a variety of stakeholders. Friends, Dr. Patel is an Indian psychiatrist and researcher. He is co-founder and former director of Center for Mental Health in London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. He is co-director of the Center for Control of Chronic Conditions at Public Health Foundation of India, a co-founder of Sangat, an NGO dedicated in research in the area of child development, adolescent health, and mental health. Dr. Patel acquired his MBBS degree from University of Bombay and Master of Science from University of Oxford. He was awarded PhD in 1997 by University of London. This is a long introduction of Patel. I would not like to read because that will take a lot of time. I would like to just end by saying that Dr. Patel is credited with fantastic research works. He has published over 250 peer-reviewed scientific articles. Dr. Patel has been awarded several awards and honors. Some of them are, in 2009, he was awarded Chalmers Medal by the Royal Society of Tropical Medicines and Hygiene, UK. Same year, elected a Fellow of Academy of Medical Science. 2014, he was awarded the Sarnath Prize in Mental Health by Institute of Medicines, USA. In 2015, awarded a Wellcome Trust Principal Research Fellowship in Clinical Science. 2015, an honorary doctorate from Georgetown University. Again, in the same year, 15, he was listed in Time magazine as amongst 100 most influential people of the world. It's a great honor for an Indian, and we really feel very proud of this achievement. In 2016, he was awarded Chanchalani Global Health Research Award. In 2019, that is this year, he was awarded Canada Gardner Global Health Award. So friends, with this introduction, I now request Dr. Vikram Patel to come over here and deliver his talk. Thank you.
So thank you all for coming. It's a big competition for me with the semi-final game that is going on, which the good news is that for those of you who are interested in the match is that actually there is probably going to be halftime very soon. And so I'm going to try and finish my talk because I also want to see the game. So my talk today really is about a very grim topic, but I'm going to try and liven it up a little bit so that, especially towards the latter part of the talk, you get a sense of the hope that we need to instill in our young people. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about the scale of the problem, why we should all be concerned as Indians about the issue of youth suicide. I'm then going to say a few things about why we have this problem. And then end by telling you a little bit about the solutions, certainly the solutions that my colleagues and I are engaged with in the last couple of decades in various parts of the country. So let me start by just setting out really the scale of the problem. And don't worry, there's going to be very little by way of any kind of textual slides, but I just wanted to ensure you knew that everything I'm presenting today actually comes from a very deep well of science. It's not just my opinion, but actually everything that I will present to you today, you can, in an era of all kinds of different kinds of facts and news, you can be sure that this is a genuine fact. These are two very important papers that are the basis of the next few slides, which really chronicle the scale of youth suicide in India. The first is the part of the Million Death Study, which I led, and this is a program of the Registrar General of India, which looks at all deaths that occur in 1 million randomly selected households across the country. And the second one was produced by Public Health Foundation of India and ICMR just last year, which is part of the Global Burden of Disease Project. So I'm just going to summarize this in a few slides to tell you what is the scale of suicide more generally in this country and what particularly is the scale of youth suicide in this country. Now, what this slide shows you is the suicide prevalence in all countries of the world. And this is from the World Health Organization's Global Health Mortality Database from last year. And if you look at this slide and look at the color coding, essentially the darker the color, the higher is the suicide rate in that country. And what you can see here, of course, is that India, along with Russia and a few other countries, are already the suicide hotspots of the world. But what this slide doesn't tell you is exactly how significant is the problem in terms of the global proportion of suicides that occur in India. And I'm going to show you that on this particular slide. Here I'm going to show you the proportion of all the world's suicides that actually occurred in India for men and women separately in the year 1990 and in the year 2016. So let me first start with men. In the year 1990, about 1 in 5 of every male suicide in the world occurred in this country. By the year 2016, this had become 1 in 4. Every fourth male suicide in the world is an Indian. In the case of women, the figures are even more dramatic. In 1990, 1 in every 4 women in the world who died of suicide was an Indian. By last year, it was 1 in 3. Think about that fact. 1 in 3 of every female suicide on this planet occurs in this country. Now, obviously, India is a very populous country, so many of us would think, well, maybe that's actually the proportion of men and women in the world who are Indian. Not really. This is actually the proportion of men and women in the world. They're less than 10%. And so you can already see that we account for a disproportionate number of the suicides in the world for both genders, both men and women. Another very important feature of suicides in India is that they're all clustered in the younger age groups. So here you can see the total proportion of suicides that occur according to age band. And here again you can see males and females for these 2 different years, but ignore that for now. Just simply look at this peak here. You can see that there is a real peak of the proportion of suicides occurring between the age of 15 and 29. What this slide doesn't tell us is that 3 out of every 4 women who will die in India through suicide is under the age of 29. And 2 out of every 3 men who will die of suicide in India is also under the age of 29. Suicide in India is a young person's problem. And it's quite interesting because most of the time when you hear about suicide in our media, it's usually about farmers. Almost none of these people are actually farmers. They're basically young Indians who are trying to make a life for themselves. Indeed, if I had to look at the overall causes of death in young Indians, this is showing you women under the age of 30 and men under the age of 30. Suicide already accounts for about 1 in 5 of all deaths under this age group. And if I had to look at all the causes of death in young Indians today, suicide ranks as the number 1 cause of death in all young Indians. Now, this is a picture that's been around for the last 10 years, actually. This is not a recent phenomenon. And it's interesting for us to pause and think that the single leading cause of death of young people in our country today is at their own hands. And I think it's also interesting to pause and think, do we even acknowledge this in public policy or conversations beyond the sensational? Well, clearly the answer is we don't. Now, there's one other very peculiar thing. One of the peculiarities of suicide in India is that, unlike in the West, suicide is an older person's problem. I should have said that earlier. In Western countries, in developed countries, suicide peaks in old age. And the reasons, obviously, in older people are quite different from younger people. In older people, it's often to do with living with very chronic conditions like cancer, being alone, losing your spouse, etc., none of which are actually true for younger people. And so you see a peak of suicide in older people in most of the world, but in India, the peak is actually in young people. Another very peculiar part of the suicide story in India is shown on this map, which again should be read according to the color coding. The darker the color coding, the higher is the suicide rate. Now, as you look at this map, I'm sure you're already wondering, how is it possible that whereas for every other health problem, the darker shades would be in the northern heartland, the poorer parts of India, UP, Bihar, Jharkhand, Orissa. But in the case of suicide, the darker shades are in the most developed parts of the country. Tamil Nadu, Kerala taking pole position, but actually, as you can see for men, also the other relatively better developed states of the country. Now I'll turn back to this. This is another real paradox. In most parts of the world, you will see that suicide actually clusters in the poorest parts of the country. In India, you see suicides clustering in the best developed parts of the country in terms of education and all the other social indicators. So it's a real mystery. India completely bucks the trend of most other countries in the world in that we are the world's hotspot for suicide, but most suicides occur in young people, and especially so in young people living in the best educated parts of this country. So let me now turn to the second part of my talk and explore the reasons of why this might be the case. Why do, first of all, young people attempt to harm themselves and kill themselves? Now, this statement often describes young people as a phenomenon around the world. They are passionate, irascible, and apt to be carried away by their impulses. This is a description that anyone who's had a teenager in their house or in their neighborhood would immediately identify with, and most of us would really assume that this is a description of modern times. This describes adolescence in modern times. In actual fact, this particular statement was made centuries ago by Aristotle. And this is actually a very important point for me to begin with. And that is, adolescents are in fact prone to impulsively harm themselves as part of who they are as adolescents. This is a global, universal phenomenon that has been present right from the beginning of time. And it isn't just the case that they're behaving this way because they are bloody-minded, but they're actually behaving this way because they actually have very unique developmental characteristics that we've only begun to understand in the last decade or so. When my son was a teenager, I thought this book was really helpful for me as a parent. But in fact, what this book actually also describes, it's a terrific book for all of you it's a very readable book. It really describes what we understand about the teenage brain. Being an adolescent is a critical phase in our lives because if you pause for a moment and think about what happens to us, moving from childhood to adulthood, you will realize that something is happening incredibly dynamically in our brains. As a child, we make no decisions of our own. None. All our decisions are outsourced. They're outsourced to our parents. What we will have for a meal, how we will go out, what we will wear, a whole range of everyday decisions are made by our parents. As an adult, we have to make every single decision for ourselves, but also oftentimes we have to make decisions for those who are dependent on us, like our own children. Adolescence is this incredible phase in which we move from being totally 100% dependent for every decision we make in our lives to being completely independent. And it doesn't happen in one day. It takes 5 to 10 years of rapid changes in our brain for that to happen. And the teenage brain really captures what we now understand about neurodevelopment. And a key feature that explains adolescent behavior lies in the discovery about 10 or 15 years ago that as our brain changes from childhood to adulthood, it doesn't all change at the same time. Certain parts of our brain change earlier than others. And this is extremely important to understand adolescence. This little cartoon shows you a cut section of our brain. The part of the brain that makes decision is this one here, right behind our foreheads. This is called the prefrontal cortex. It is the most important part of our brains. It is what distinguishes us from all other animals, including primates. It is the part of our brain in which we make decisions. Should I light up a cigarette? Maybe not, because it's going to harm my health. Should I wear a condom on this sexual encounter? Maybe I should, because I will otherwise risk an infection or get my partner pregnant. These are the sorts of decisions that we think about in everyday life as adults. And this is the part of the brain that enables us to think of the pros and the cons, the consequences of our various decisions. However, here is the thing about adolescents that makes them different from us as adults. This part of the brain, which is marked in red, is deep inside our brain. It's called the limbic cortex. And it is the part of the brain that mediates what neuroscientists, believe it or not, these are neuroscientific terms, they're called hot emotions. And you can see why they're hot emotions. Joy, rage, fear, excitement, these are primal emotional states. Now here's the thing. This part of the brain matures 5 to 6 years earlier than our prefrontal cortex. What does that mean? That means that when I'm 30 years old and I'm excited, I will be thinking about the consequences of my actions when I'm excited before I actually behave, before I act. But when I'm 15 years old, when that part of my brain that tells me to take a pause, take a break, and think about the consequences is not even there. It's not ready to help me make that decision. I will act impulsively. And that is the classic nature of adolescent behavior. It isn't that they're, as I said earlier, they're behaving to irritate us. They're actually behaving the way they're biologically primed to behave. Now, whereas neuroscientists have only discovered this about 10 or 15 years ago, the truth is that one person knew this a much longer time ago, and that was, of course, Walt Disney. You take any of Walt Disney's films, or at least most of them, you will find that there is a particular juvenile or adolescent character in that film. And across all of Disney's films, the adolescent character behaves in a very similar way. And I'm going to give you 3 examples. Lion King, which will soon be released in its Hindi version very shortly in India, re-released. Many of you will have seen that film, and you will remember the lion cub, Simba. What does Simba do? Simba is told by his dad that you mustn't wander away from the pride because there is a section of the savannah which is very dangerous where his uncle, who has been excommunicated from the pride, is hanging out and he is a bad guy. What does Simba do? He goes exactly, impulsively, out of excitement, out of curiosity, out of the thrill of taking a risk. He goes out to explore that particular section of the savannah and gets into trouble. Nemo does the same thing. His dad tells him, don't go swimming up to the surface of the ocean because it's a dangerous place for a baby fish and you will get caught. And of course, that's exactly what Nemo does. And my favorite of all of Disney's films, in the Jungle Book, Mowgli is absolutely certain that he will never leave the jungle even though it's lurking with all kinds of dangers because it's so exciting and because he loves Baloo, until, of course, he sees this young lady at a river stream, and that's on an impulse. All his life's dreams he abandons and walks straight out of the jungle. Now, in many ways, this kind of impulsivity is a very important part of our becoming an adult. It is an adaptive phase of life in which the essential skills we need as adults are actually laid down, because it is only through taking risks and learning from those risk-taking behaviors do we learn what is going to harm us and what is going to be good for us, so that as adults, we make more sensible decisions in our life. So this is quite an important part of adaptive development. However, let's look at the darker side of impulsivity. The darker side of impulsivity is this, that when the threat in our environment is one that makes us feel miserable, when there is something happening in our social world that makes us feel humiliated or lose hope, then our impulse to hurt ourselves can be lethal. And that is a very central part of the story as to why suicide is a leading cause of death in adolescents in all countries of the world, not just in India. These are the most common kinds of threats in young people's lives today that we should be very aware of. Bullying is an extremely important issue in schools and in colleges. There's, of course, a new phenomenon that most of us didn't even experience in our adolescence, which is all kinds of things happening on social media, which we haven't barely even begun to understand in terms of its impact on young people's well-being. But we know already, for example, that so many young people are attempting to harm themselves because they've been trolled or they've been bullied online, or because of these very strange kinds of networks of young people who actually try to encourage each other even to harm themselves. The shameless marketing of alcohol, I'm not at all for prohibition, but I am absolutely for making sure that people under the age of 18 are not being marketed alcohol, because we know that, in fact, in the same way that the brain is a work in progress at the age of 15, giving anyone at that age any kind of drug that will affect the brain is likely to be harmful. So these are all things that happen everywhere in the world, and they also happen in India. But there's one particular thing that is unique to India. It is the same thing that's happened in every country that has undergone a dramatic social change. And that is what I called the aspirational gap. Let me explain to you what I mean. The aspirational gap for me is the gap between a young person's wishes and desires as to who they want to be and how they want to live their life, and the social world in which they find themselves in that crushes that desire, that denies them that aspiration. This happened and has happened in every society, along with industrialization, along with urbanization, as young people began to break away from rigid social orders and structures that used to constrain their lives. For example, in the 1960s in Britain, in the 1970s in Australia, and I will turn to the Chinese story towards the end of my talk. It is happening in India right now. And this is the reason why suicide rates are highest in the most developed parts of India. They are the highest in the most developed parts of India because the aspirations of young people in the most developed parts of India are the greatest. When I'm in Tamil Nadu and I've been to a very good college, I am educated, I have a dream, I have a hope for myself, I have access to the internet, I can see how young people everywhere live. Social comparison is a profoundly important aspect of being an adolescent. This is why peers are so important. But now my peers are not just the people in my little community, my neighborhood, my colony, but my peers are actually young people like myself all over the world. And what I have to face is this: the complete failure of society to actually address those aspirations in a progressive, in a liberal, in a mature way. The age-old divisions of our country to do with caste, for example, or the age-old attitudes in our country about what kinds of careers are meaningful or what kinds of institutions one can study in, continue to trap our young people in these orthodoxies from which there is often no escape. It isn't surprising, in fact, that the failure of our society to respond in a progressive way to young people's aspirations keeps showing up in these sorts of headlines. Now, all of you will have heard, of course, of the tuition factory of Kota. And there's been a lot written about Kota. Kota is just a good example because there's so many tuition factories in there. But this particular piece from this journalist, Poonam, really caught my eye because it was one of the most thoughtful journalistic accounts of what was happening in Kota. This was 57 lives that died in one single year in Kota. And I'm going to actually quote directly from her article. And what she did was, it was a superb piece of journalism, really, where she went to Kota and spoke to many of the students who were living in those hostels in Kota, studying to get into IIT or into AIMS or one of these other colleges. This is a picture from one of those tuition classes. You can see it looks almost like an animal farm, all cooped up like that. But here is a statement, and it really speaks for itself in terms of, do we really listen to young people in our country? Kumar doesn't see himself as an IIT-type guy. I could do with a theoretical kind of education like geography or a BSc in maths. My parents had permitted me to do it, but family friends said no. It's interesting, when we talk of social pressures, it's not just about our family, because each of us as parents will say, I let my child do whatever he wants, but my child isn't only growing up in my family. My child is growing up in India. Send him to prepare to become an engineer. Going back means I'm wasting a lot of their money, he added. They will feel sad, but they will not say anything. We are economically not that well off. My father runs a general store back home, but they have always spent on my education, perhaps because they expect that I will do something for them at the end. But what is it that he wants to do, I asked him, now that he was in the mood to talk. Never thought about that, he said, eyes to the floor. I have never felt that free. And this, sadly, is the reality of young people's experiences, and ironically, not just in lower socioeconomic groups. This is, in fact, perhaps even more true in higher socioeconomic groups where aspirations are even greater, but the world that young people find themselves in are often completely closed. But for me, perhaps the real tragic loss of hope comes from the aspiration to love who you want. I think there must be few places in the world where people are killing themselves because they fell in love with someone from the wrong community or caste. And this really strikes me as perhaps the greatest tragedy in modern India, that even the right to love someone is no longer your own right. It is a right that has to be constrained according to old prejudices that continue to prevail, and sadly, as we can see in some parts of India, are actually growing with all these crazy movements that we hear about. And these are, of course, just a snapshot of a few stories. If you look at the coroner statistics of youth suicide in India, you will find broken love affairs is one of the leading causes of death reported in the coroner's report. Let me assure you, those broken love affairs aren't being dumped by someone. Very often, they're broken love affairs because your parents got you married off to somebody from your caste or community before you could make a decision to go out with someone else. So I want to end now by thinking of something positive. How do we actually address this crisis? Make no mistake, we are in a crisis. We already have the world's largest number of young people killing themselves and the highest suicide rates in young people in the world. One of the highest actually ever recorded in history. If we have to address this sort of aspirational gap, it isn't the matter of just you and me doing something. The well-being of children and young people, as someone else has said, and I'm going to actually paraphrase that, is a political choice. It is not a matter of doctors, hospitals, and the health system. It is a political choice that something like this does not, in fact, lead young people to kill themselves. Now, all of us have aspirations of a good political choice here, and we all hope that there will be that right political choice, but we need to do something here and now as well. And so I'm going to turn to what we are doing as an organization here and now, trying in this extremely oppressive social climate for young people to do two things: to restore hope in young people that there is a future where they will have a life of their choice, and while we also build hope, enabling help for young people who need interventions, who need support when they're going through crises. And I'm going to give you a series of brief examples with a couple of videos that actually demonstrate some of the work that we're doing. And this is work that we're doing with Sangat, the NGO that you heard about earlier, and also with Public Health Foundation of India when we were able to work there. Some of you know PHFI has had some changes, but most of this work now is being done with Sangat. And we published our findings, the first set of findings, in the Lancet Medical Journal last year. What did we find? We found that this simple act of giving young people agency in the school reduced violence rates in the school by more than 70%. The simple act of just doing that. The simple act of giving young people an opportunity to actually influence the way their school was run dropped mental health distress rates by more than 50%. And we found that after 2 years, there was an incremental effect. In other words, the longer you continue this kind of work, the continuing effect there is. We're delighted now that on the back of these results with the Bajaj Foundation, we are now actually doing a scale-up in the region of Pune, and we hope that we are actually going to be doing a lot more of this with other governments as well going forward, and also with other school people who run schools. The second kind of intervention that we're doing is trying to work directly with young people to talk more openly about mental health. As you know, this is a subject that the moment you use the word mental health, let's be honest, the first thing all of you think about is pagal. This is also true in schools. Why? Because, of course, our kids imbibe the kind of prejudiced ideas that people have about mental health in their own thinking. So we want to break through that barrier that always says mental health equals psychiatry, psychiatric illness, medication. This is the classic kind of association that we form, and get people to talk about mental health in the same way as they talk about physical health. And I want to show you a short video that we have designed as a part of a classroom session that is run by one of our programs called Pride in Delhi schools. And what this particular video does is a single class period. The facilitator shows the video and then does a question answer session with the students, and I'll let the video speak for itself.
मानसिक स्वास्थ्य क्या होता है? हम जब मानसिक स्वास्थ्य की बात करते हैं तो मन में तनाव या खुशी या गम जैसे फीलिंग्स आते हैं, या फिर डिप्रेशन और बाइपोलर डिसऑर्डर जैसे मेंटल इलनेसेस के बारे में हम सोचते हैं। हमारी ज़िंदगी में कई उतार चढ़ाव आते हैं और हम हर दिन नई प्रॉब्लम से जूझते हैं। प्रॉब्लम्स जैसे फ्रेंड्स हमारे कपड़ों का मजाक उड़ाते हैं, किस स्टाइल से बात करते हैं या कैसे चलते हैं। प्रॉब्लम्स जिनका हमें कोई अंदाजा नहीं होता, जैसे किसी फ्रेंड या फैमिली मेंबर की मृत्यु, कोई बुरा या मुश्किल ब्रेकअप या किसी बुरे अपमानजनक रिश्ते में उलझना, या एग्जाम्स या एंट्रेंस में फेल होना। हमारे बड़े होने के साथ साथ जो जिम्मेदारियां आती है उनसे जूझना। अच्छा मानसिक स्वास्थ्य या मेंटल हेल्थ हमें जिंदगी की इन छोटी और बड़ी प्रॉब्लम्स का सामना करने की ताकत देता है और फिर से जिंदगी में पूरी तरह से शामिल होने में हमारी हेल्प करता है। इसके बिना जिंदगी इतनी सुंदर और उज्जवल नहीं लगती। आज खराब मानसिक स्वास्थ्य युवाओं के अनहेल्दी होने का सबसे बड़ा कारण है। किसी से इस बारे में बातचीत करना मदद पाने का सबसे पहला स्टेप है, और जब अपने फ्रेंड या कोई फैमिली मेंबर को मदद की जरूरत हो तो उनकी बात संवेदनशीलता से सुननी चाहिए। कभी कभी हम ऐसी फीलिंग से डरते हैं, शर्मिंदा होते हैं, लेकिन हमारा मानसिक स्वास्थ्य बहुत जरूरी है। चलो इस बारे में मिलकर बात करते हैं। आज तुम कैसे हो?
This particular program has had incredible impact in our schools. You know, after we've done these classroom sessions, not nearly 1 out of every 5 kids has come forward asking for some kind of help. And the help is not always for some mental illness. The help is often for the sorts of social issues and threats to young people's well-being that I've mentioned to you earlier. And so what we then need to do is respond to this. And we did this in the same schools by developing a very brief problem-solving intervention. Remember I had mentioned earlier that one of the real key problems, developmental challenges that adolescents face is this part of the brain isn't ready to help them think through in a calm and measured way how to deal with problems. But we can help adolescents who are 15 and 16 years old develop those skills, particularly those who are seeking help. So we actually have been doing a program in the same 6 schools in which we deliver these counseling interventions that were focusing not on mental illness, but actually on strengthening problem-solving skills. This was another experiment, just like the Bihar one, a randomized control trial, which we just unblinded the results last month. And we're thrilled to see the very large effects of this problem-solving intervention on the problem-solving skills of these young people, but most importantly, on their own self-reported problems and how they were coping with it. This is another short video, and I love this video because it actually captures the voices of some of the young people from these New Delhi government schools, as well as some of the principals, parents, and teachers, and the counselors who actually deliver these interventions. These counselors are essentially lay counselors. They're not psychologists. They're ordinary young people in our communities who we train in delivering the intervention. So another little video for you.
मतलब जैसे मैं परेशान रहती थी और मतलब जो पेपर में याद करके जाती थी वो नहीं हो पाता था।
मैं जॉब करता हूँ, इस चक्कर में थोड़ी पढ़ने में प्रॉब्लम हो।
टेंशन में कुछ भी हो सकता है, कुछ भी कर सकता है इंसान, हाथ कट कर सकता है। आजकल तो फांसियाँ बहुत ज़्यादा लगा लेते हैं बच्चे।
इस एज में ना दिमाग उड़ता रहता है हवा में, कुछ समझ में नहीं आता, ना पढ़ाई में दिमाग लगा।
काउंसलिंग के बारे में हमारे स्कूल में बताया गया था और हमसे पूछा गया कि अगर आपको किसी भी तरह की परेशानी है तो आप ये फॉर्म फिल करके दे सकते हैं काउंसलिंग।
हर हफ्ते मैं वहाँ जाता था तो वो मुझे कुछ ना कुछ प्रॉब्लम से रिलेटेड समस्या मतलब सुधारने के लिए कुछ आइडिया देते थे, टिप्स देते थे कि कोई भी हमारी जो समस्या होती है उसे सॉल्व करने के लिए पहले कई अन्य तरीके, जितने तरीके हो सकें सॉल्व करने के वो तरीके निकालो, फिर उन सब तरीकों में से जो सबसे बेटर तरीका हो उस पर मतलब काम करना चाहिए, हमें ध्यान दें
कि अगर हम मान लो बातों से समझाएं तो बच्चे को उनमें लगता है उतना ना समझ में आए, तो अगर बुक के माध्यम से जाते हैं, स्टोरी के माध्यम से, तो बच्चों को रियलाइज़ होता है कि हाँ कि अगर इनके साथ प्रॉब्लम है तो मेरे साथ भी हो सकती है। तो बच्चों को कहीं ना कहीं समस्या चुनने में और समझने में भी हेल्प मिलती है बुक के माध्यम से।
उन किताबों से पढ़ के ना हमारे अपने वाला अनुभव हो रहा था। उन किताबों में जो दे रखे थे ना कैरेक्टर, वो हमारे जैसे
के बारे में समझा रखा था कि क्या बोलते हैं उसमें अपनी समस्या लिखना है, 3 समस्या लिखना था, तो मैंने 3 समस्या लिखी थी।
कोई होता है ना, कोई चाहता है कि मेरी प्रॉब्लम कोई और दूसरा नहीं बस वही सॉल्व होए, कि कोई एक ही को पता हो, तो मैं उससे वो मैं काफ़ी अच्छा बेनिफिट है कि मैं कोई प्रभाव नहीं पड़ता उसके ऊपर उल्टा।
तो जैसे 3 4 5 सेशन तक मुझे ये अच्छा लगा कि बच्चा यहाँ पर आके जो पीओटी टेक्निक हम सिखा रहे थे उससे अब उसने सॉल्व करा और उसे सीख कर जो उसके गुस्से की प्रॉब्लम थी अब वो बहुत कम हो गई, वो बहुत अच्छा रहता है, रिलैक्स रहता है, क्लास के और लोगों से भी बात करता है। और ये फीडबैक मुझे उसके क्लास टीचर ने भी दिया।
जो टाइम टेबल बना था ना उसके हिसाब से चल रहा हूँ तो घर भी सही है और पढ़ाई भी सही है।
मेरी प्रॉब्लम तो गुस्सा और वो कंट्रोल
नया चेंज आया बच्चे में तो मैं खुशी हुई, अच्छा लगा। ये ज़्यादा गुस्सा है तो मतलब क्या बोलते हैं उस टाइम मतलब पढ़ना नहीं चाहिए, कोई अच्छे शांत जगह मतलब बैठ के ठंडा दिमाग हो जाएगा तो तब पढ़ना चाहिए। ये सब अभी तक
तो बता देते थोड़ा फ्री हो जाते हैं, जब कहीं तक बात पहुँचेगी घर वालों को भी पता चल जाएगा क्या चाहते हैं हम।
अगर हम अभी से अपना प्रेजेंट अच्छा करके चलेंगे हमारा फ्यूचर भी अच्छा।
And so this particular program, which really relies on a very well-established scientific mechanism called problem solving, is actually now something that my colleagues from Sangat and others, some of whom are actually present here today, have been implementing in New Delhi schools. Now, of course, the demand is huge. And we can't necessarily have counselors delivering these interventions face-to-face always, although that would be my preferred goal because people like to sit with another person. But instead, we also need to find ways in which we can scale up this problem-solving approach at a much wider scale. And with that in mind, we have been developing an app that can be delivered through any smartphone or a tablet. It follows exactly the same principles, but is presented as a game. We've been working with a wonderful gaming company called Quicksand, with whom we've actually designed this app. We've gone through many different versions. It's been co-produced with young people, but uses exactly the same theory as problem solving that you have been using in New Delhi schools. And currently, we're actually piloting the use of this app in schools in Goa. And so the idea would be that we can actually offer schools and young people choices between a face-to-face counseling model, which is very brief, only 2 or 3 weeks, or an app which can be done in a lab computer session, which can be delivered to all young people to actually strengthen their counseling skills. And the final thing that we're doing is actually engaging beyond our schools and beyond our narrow neighborhoods to the whole country in a program called It's Okay to Talk, which is really, again, you can imagine what that word It's Okay to Talk is really talking about. It's really trying to get people to talk about mental health with the same comfort level that we talk about physical health or indeed anything else in our lives. And our core philosophy here is that by using media that are engaging for young people, the internet, there's a website called It's Okay to Talk, for example, where people can post their own personal stories about mental health problems and how they recover. These are stories of hope. But also a variety of other kinds of media like talks by young people, as you can see in the bottom left, puppet shows in New Delhi schools as well as in many other parts of the country, exhibitions, music, and most recently, Sangat has just won a very large award from the Wellcome Trust to actually create a digital museum that can go to tier 2 towns and take stories of young people, not just stories that are told in the way that in the written form, but also stories that are told through photographs, videos, etc., and can become a touring national exhibition that can be used to actually create a national conversation for young people on mental health. I might show you this video if I have time. It's really another 3-minute video. If we have time, I'll show it to you. It's really describing some of the work that the public engagement campaign is doing. I want to end by, simply saying that I mentioned earlier, that tackling children and young people's well-being in our country is a political choice. It's not left to the doctors and hospitals to deal with this. And because we often compare ourselves to China, I thought the example of China would be a good one to actually end with. So China, in the early 1990s, is where India is today. It was in the midst of the same social change that India is in right now, in terms of the dramatic changes in urbanization, in aspirations of young people, etc. And back in the late 1980s, 1990, the suicide rate in China was just as high as it is in India today. China was the suicide hotspot of the world. What you can see here is if suicide had remained unchanged in China is the black line up there. But the true rate of suicide in China is shown by the blue line here, which means that over the last 20 odd years, 1 million less Chinese people have died due to suicide. Assuming, of course, that if this is the gap between what would have been the suicide numbers had the suicide rate not changed and the true levels of suicide. I have spoken a lot to my colleagues in China about, what is the reason for this dramatic saving of lives that has happened in China. Something that, is actually a miracle. If you think there must be few medical or health conditions where such a large number of lives have been saved that most people don't even acknowledge or know about. And when you ask my colleagues in China, they say it's a mix of things. There isn't one thing that does it. But amongst the things that are extremely important is the greater freedom for women, the greater freedom and agency for women to choose lives of their own, in particular to choose their husbands, and if they ever get married or have kids, or when they have kids. Of course, in China, that's another story altogether. The opportunity for young people to urbanize and move to cities and shake off some of the old rigid social hierarchies that existed in China. Of course, China was already in many ways abandoning those hierarchies due to communist principles, but nevertheless, there was still a very strong class system in rural China. Urbanization helped people escape from that. The emphasis on good quality education, on job creation, these are all the very important structural factors that has led to this dramatic reduction in the number of suicides in China. Alongside that, improving access to mental health care. China today has one of the largest universal health coverage programs in mental health in the world. And it did this 10 years ago. And interestingly enough, when China's universal health coverage program was begun, mental health was actually the first condition of all the chronic conditions that it addressed. And I guess in our country, we are making the same progress in some ways. The fact that the mental health care bill in India has decriminalized suicide, but has also given Indians the right to mental health care, in my mind, is a tremendous positive development at the highest level of policymakers. How can we all make, I wouldn't say the Chinese model happen in our country, we have to have our own model in our own country. How can we all make sure that this incredible tragedy of young people killing themselves in epic numbers in India is brought under control? I think preventing youth suicide is everybody's business. It's not just the government. The government has to play a very important role, but I think it's everyone's business. And I want to highlight 3 levels at which we can do that. First of all, in our own homes. I don't think this audience is really the primary audience for me to lecture on this issue, but certainly in the homes of the average Indian adolescent, where prejudices about issues to do with, for example, the choices we make of careers, the choices of education, and of course the most important choice we will make in our lives, about who we decide to live with and love, these are choices that we must learn to respect in adolescents and young adults. And it is extremely important that this can only happen and begin with in our own homes. Obviously, as we've seen examples from some of the narratives you've heard earlier, we don't live in a vacuum as families. We live within a broader social milieu. And as a community and as a nation, we need to ask ourselves questions about the importance of respecting the aspirations, dignity, and really the desires of our young people. Progressive attitudes towards sexuality. I can only celebrate what happened in the Supreme Court. It came 70 years too late that we gave up and finally abandoned colonial law on homosexuality. But there are many other aspects of sexuality that we need to learn to respect. I'm always amazed when people say that premarital sex is a big concern in India. What else do you expect when people are expected to get married at the age of 25? What are they going to be doing until the age of 25? It seems almost that it should be a norm. In fact, I often think Indians are the most undersexed adolescents in the world when you compare to anywhere else. It's because we live in an incredibly oppressive atmosphere where even talking about sex before marriage is unthinkable. We have to really, as a society, free our kids from these sorts of attitudes. But also, I think we need to recognize that the employment market is increasingly fragile and insecure for many young people, and we need to work as a society towards addressing that. My own work with Sangat is a lot to do with schools. I strongly believe that schools are an incredibly wonderful platform for us to work with young people, to build resilience, to build problem-solving skills, and to ultimately address some of the other factors that young people experience in their daily lives in terms of violence and gender discrimination. And I want to just end by saying, ultimately, as a society, we really must strive to ensure that we live in a country, in a world in which no young person should be forced to kill themselves because they don't have a choice of the love and the life they lead. I will end with showing you this video, and that's the last video, which is really some voices of young people in the It's Okay to Talk initiative.
We are all people, and we all have mental health. And our mental health goes through many ups and downs, just like life does.
I was suffering from depression.
मेरे साथ काफ़ी प्रॉब्लम हुआ था कि मैं 12th में फेल हो गया था 2 बार.
I've been diagnosed with clinical depression and I'm a suicide attempt survivor.
Growing up, I felt that I could not express myself. I felt a lack of confidence, and I felt that a lot of the things and stresses and anxiety that I'm feeling, I'm in it alone.
So there was a lot of social anxiety, and if I would go out in large groups, I would just feel uncomfortable.
I've been overweight all my life. I was bullied for it, which led to a lot of body image issues.
मैं मास्टर्स में था तो मुझे बहुत ज़्यादा डिफिकल्टीज थी, खास करके इंग्लिश लैंग्वेज को लेकर.
When I was young, the symptoms used to be really bad, especially the mood swings and the sleeplessness.
Mental health problems are very common, especially for young people. But many of us don't know when we might be experiencing difficulties or have mental health needs. And we often face struggles in talking about this or finding the help we need. It can often be difficult to open up. It can be scary to understand what we are experiencing. And it can sometimes be hard to accept or live with.
जब मैंने अपनी प्रॉब्लम रिकॉग्नाइज करी तो उसके बाद अपनी फैमिली का सपोर्ट लिया.
The first thing that I did while I was going through depression was speak to my mother and share my problem with her.
Having those friends, especially I think friends really play an important role, like at least in my life, because I'm not out to my family, so they don't know a lot of issues. So my friend knew it, and they stood by me a lot. And how positively you can talk about mental health.
I started reaching out to information mostly online. I started reading books. I started watching videos about psychology, mental health.
Last year I started seeking help because I started working in mental health care. And I felt it was necessary for me to resolve and deal with my own issues.
फिर एक टाइम आया कि मुझे कुछ लोग मिले जहाँ पर मुझे बात करने का मौका मिला और जहाँ मैं अपने बारे में बता पाया और लोगों के बारे में भी सुन पाया.
It's Okay to Talk is a public engagement project by Sangat that builds awareness about mental health through storytelling and building spaces for conversations and learning. It engages young people with mental health information and helps build their capacities to address mental health needs.
When first I told my dad that I think I need help, he did not understand what I meant, and then I had to tell him that I need to see a therapist. I don't think I can go on without that. That's when I decided that I'm going to share my story as much as possible because I felt it was empowering.
If even one person can read my story and get the help they need, or know that someone else like them is out there and they're doing everything they can to take care of their mental health, and that person can do it too, I think I've achieved what I set out to accomplish.
Mental health problems are the biggest challenge for young people in India today, but your story matters and can change this.
Okay, thank you very much. That was the end of my talk. Thank you.
So now there is time for some question answers. So the floor is open for questions. Madam, please identify yourself and then put your question.
And I have seen change in the society. I came from a very low socio-economic background. And my mother was wanted the girls to be educated, and she educated 7 of us, 7 daughters, in a small place where there is only a primary school, Shahadra, and we used to commute to Delhi and she sent me to medical college. I find that the parents need more counseling than the adolescents. Yesterday also there was a talk in my institution, pediatrician talking about how to prepare an adolescent. So I said that what about the parents? The parents have to also groom them and tell them about the realities of life. I went through the reality of life, so I learned. But these days, if both the parents are working, who is taking care of the child? No one. So that is the thing. The children are not free with their parents because they have no time. So the society is a very complicated society these days. So I feel they need more counseling than the children.
I think you're really right. I think parents need to understand about the differences between a child and an adolescent, and most parents think you're a child till you get married. I mean, let's be honest. I think most of us who have, have gone through this cycle in our lives will remember our parents never treated us as adults till we finally found someone and settled down. And I think this attitude that we have, that you are a child until you get married, which is also akin to being sexually, therefore, active, is something which is it's something which we've had because, as I sometimes provocatively tell a school, I often speak in schools where I tell parents, your kids will have sex later in life than you did. And they look shocked, and I say, well, don't be shocked. Let's think, when did you first have sex? And they will all think, of course, when they got married, which was when they were 16, back then. And say, now, what about your kids? And they say, they're 25, he's still doing PhD. And you think, well, all right, so what do you think? Is he active or not? And I think then people begin to realize that, my goodness, this is a different generation, it's a different time, and we have not changed. Our kids have changed, the times have changed, but we remain stuck in a way of thinking about growing up that is still extremely old. So I think you're right. I don't know how one does that because, the state will always consider parenting as private business. And it is actually ultimately at some level private business. How do we work with parents? And I don't know if you have a thought on that or others do. How do we reach out to parents to get them to adapt to the fact that we live in completely different times to the ones that we grew up ourselves?
Yes, please.
Thank you, sir, for that enlightening talk. Myself, Siddharth, I am working with an organization called Samarthya. We work in government schools with school management committees. So it's basically about decentralization of educational governance in the government schools. I have two questions. First one is regarding, so Delhi government has started this happiness curriculum, which they are doing it in all schools. I want to know if you have any comments on that, if you have been able to see the quality of it and the content of it. The second is, since you talked a lot about schools, the need of it in schools, do you think there is a need of it, introducing something like this in the teacher education programs, like B.Ed and all of those things? Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Yeah, the second question is easy to answer in the sense that, yes, I do think so. But I do also think that teachers have a lot on their plate. I tell you my experience in Bihar. We tried to do this program with both teachers as well as a counselor. And we found the teacher program did not work. It's not because teachers were, not good in what they do, which is teaching, but it is that we're asking them to do something completely different to what they have been trained to do. And teaching is also a very full-time job. I'm increasingly coming around to thinking that simply asking teachers to do more is not the right solution. Instead, we should respect what teachers do. And certainly the B.Ed curriculum should be more informed about these sorts of issues like well-being and mental health and so on. And teacher practices need to change. Corporal punishment, for example. And so, a lot of the suicides you'll read about were, kids who have been, humiliated by their teachers, etc. That clearly has to change. But the larger goal of improving the environment of the school from a mental health and well-being perspective shouldn't be left only to teachers. I do think there's a role of a counselor in every school. In terms of the happiness curriculum, I have to be honest, in none of the 6 schools that we were working, that curriculum had really been rolled out in the last year. Maybe this year we'll see more of it. So I can't really comment on either the content or especially your question, whether the quality of the rollout. I believe that the EVGC counselors are also just beginning to get rolled out in many of the Delhi government schools.
Yes, please.
My name is Divya, and I'm here just as a parent, just out of curiosity. Firstly, I would like to congratulate Dr. Patel. The presentation was very interesting, and also the statistics were startling. Never realized that this is what is happening. And as a parent, I'll just share what happened. My daughter had asked me that, she wants some counseling. And since we are talking about, educating the parents, I didn't know how to go about it. I mean, this word, where do I start from? And I'm a so-called educated parent. So maybe there is some sort of public awareness that is required, even amongst, like I said, the so-called educated. Also, since I did eventually get the counseling done, it was compounded, like I said, because of her best friend committed suicide, and she herself was studying in a different city, and a lot of factors added up. Anyway, that was done, but also what I've realized, speaking to other people, there's a huge amount of stigma associated with this word counseling. I got to know of a case where a child who crossed 12th, so all the best friends went to various different universities to study, and she was sharing her problems with a friend who was in the US, and the parents refused to get anything done because they said, "Hamara bachcha pagal nahi hai. We will not take the child to a counselor." So how do you get into this public awareness?
So, this is a really big issue. I don't think there's a straightforward answer to this other than persevering and delinking the idea of mental health from mental illness. I think the problem has been for far too long, every time the word mental health is used, it is automatically associated with the asylum. And this is, of course, historically also the way mental health has been provided in India. We cannot ignore the fact that the landscape of mental health care in India is very dominated by medicine, psychiatrists, and hospitals. This is a legacy like many of the other awful legacies of colonial rule. We have to reinvent mental health with our real local grounding, and that means delinking mental health from medicine. And that might sound like a very provocative statement, but if it means helping people to think about mental health as a personal asset, something which is central to each and every one of our lives. I think the last videos that the young lady said, we all have mental health. All of us sitting in this room have mental health. This is what we thrive on. This is what makes us function. If we begin to reframe the conversations about mental health away from illness and sickness and disability and medicines and becoming a zombie, over time, I have no doubt that we will see a new conversation. And I'll tell you why I have no doubt. The countries that actually built the asylums abandoned them about 30 years ago. Today, the conversation on mental health in those countries is completely different to what it used to be. And again, I think we are about 30 years behind them. Maybe we don't have to wait for another 30 years. We can push forward, but we can see those countries. For example, New Zealand, who I hope we beat later on today, but I have to admire. But I have to say, I admire their amazing new policy. Their Prime Minister's marquee policy for the year has been a major new well-being budget in which the single biggest amount of money has been towards mental health. It's the single biggest, New Zealand government investment for the year. But it's not on mental illness. It's not on hospitals and more treatment. It's actually on the kinds of things that I described to you earlier. Building skills, building safer communities, building young people's skills and conversations around mental health, creating spaces where young people can actually talk about mental health. I think that's the journey we have to take. We're a long way away from that, but I am very optimistic that we will get there.
Please. Thank you. My name is Yogendra Kumar. I actually just wanted to compliment you on your talk. I just want to make one point. Actually, it's really a question of social attitude that you bring out in your talk. And I think perhaps that it has to be a combination of a new education policy as well as a health care policy. Because I'm quite sure that, if let us say even the schools or even the quota school that you talked about, if as part of their curriculum there is something about mental well-being, perhaps a lot of the stress triggered suicide, I think, can be avoided. But the second issue, of course, is that when you talk in terms of health, there is a whole informal sector. After all, even in the homes, we receive some kind of ideas as to how we should cope with stress or different kinds of disappointments when we are under pressure for competition and so on and so forth. Whether they are village elders or whether they are family elders or whatever, you pick up this kind of thing. And perhaps in that, I think all that can be weaved into a kind of a holistic policy, which I think might take care of that. And just one point I want to make here. I think you ended your talk by saying about choice for sex and career. Now, I think particularly in a society like India's, as to how the subject of sex is to be discussed in a socially acceptable manner, I think that is something where a lot of attention needs to be paid, because that's not quite an easy thing to do. And so also for children from the lower middle class or even from the working class families, on them the pressure actually is quite high. So I think that approach actually has to reach out to those segments of society as well. Thank you.
You know, I agree with you entirely. It's, you know, it's easy for me to say these things. It's you know, we live in a country that has attitudes and orthodoxies that go back millennia, and it's not going to change anytime soon. But I will tell you what will change. It's when the young people of today become the parents of tomorrow. That's what's happened in every society. You know, it's interesting, when the Indian suicide data came out, I read this wonderful piece in the EPW, the Economic and Political Weekly, from an Australian academic, who said that actually the same thing happened in Australia in the late 60s, early 70s. And he drew parallels with what happened in the UK, in England, in the 1950s. And what was he referring to? He was referring to, because even in those countries, it turns out, in Ireland, for example, if a woman was pregnant outside wedlock, she was sent to a mental hospital. So this is not just an Indian phenomenon. Those sorts of very, very constraining and, you know, attitudes towards young people's sexuality was very prevalent in the West. But it was education, it was urbanization, it was empowerment of women and young people that now today, of course, you know, most young people in England don't even get married anymore. So I'm saying that the same thing in China, and I think we will see that. We will see that in India, but I think during that period we need to also work on our societal attitudes. I will say one more thing about policy. Actually, we have some pretty good policies. The new draft national education policy that's been under a lot of discussion right now is actually a pretty good policy. Most of it is, in fact, very forward-looking. It's a very well-thought-through policy. The problem really lies in how you go from these really well-designed policies to actual ground-level implementation. This is a real struggle. And I think that is where the real hard work has to be done at state level, going down to the schools, you know. My own sense is there's also wonderful things happening in Delhi, for example. I have to say the government schools here are doing really well. From what I've seen, under the pressures that they work under, the large class sizes, the very lower socioeconomic kids who come there, it's actually pretty impressive what they manage to do. So there is a hope there in terms of opportunity and will.
Yes, please. There is a minister for...
Please identify yourself, sir.
Atul Mittal, journalist, freelance. There is a minister for preventing suicide in England. What would you like to say about this?
Actually, the minister there is for mental health, not for suicide, for mental health. There is a minister for mental health, you're right. And there's a minister...
Crouch.
Sorry, yeah. But the title is Minister for Mental Health, and also there's a Minister for Loneliness, which is an interesting one. You know, I think it's interesting because we're not, luckily, a society where loneliness is a major issue right now. But Britain and many European countries, which is aging, loneliness is becoming an issue, and we now know that loneliness is a major cause of ill health and, you know, all kinds of problems. So I think those countries are beginning to recognize that these are issues for which there needs to be a political choice on how society responds. So, for example, I read that the loneliness minister's main agenda is to get people to talk to each other, which in England is not easy to do because people generally, you know, culturally do not do that. In India, at least, luckily, we haven't got that problem. But just to get people to talk to each other, have a conversation, when you see someone sitting alone, you know, chatting with them is not is something that we should do as a society. Those are the things they do. In our case, my problem is that we don't talk when people are distressed. We ignore them. And I think we need to actually have a somewhat different kind of campaign, that when you see that someone is looking unhappy or distressed, if your friend suddenly looks quiet, just ask them what's going on. Reaching out to people is something we should be doing much more frequently.
Yes, last two questions. Yes,
Hi.
please.
Hi.
Just 1 minute, sir, 1 minute.
Hi, this is Mridang from Public Health Foundation of India. The question is, while we wait for the therapists in India to become a common household name or the counselors to become readily available, how do you see technology enabling first aid for mental health? And are there models in the world that you have sort of seen that we can understand to see technology-led interventions that enable a common man to respond to his immediate surroundings? Carrying forward from the comment that you were making about how we should listen to people around us.
Yeah, so definitely there. I mean, I think it's not either or. Your question is absolutely right. I think we can do something quite very soon. We don't have to wait for counselors everywhere, and that's already happening. I'm trying to remember the name of the app, which even I've used, where you go there and you just put in, what your problem is, and it's almost like a chatbot, and it takes you through a set of questions, and then at the end of it, it gives you a sense, okay, you might be having this problem, this is what you should do. I think that kind of technology, which is informational giving, engaging with you. The other kind of technology is like the 7 Cups, which is actually an American technology, which essentially gets people to become listeners. You learn very basic skills of listening and providing what you can call psychological first aid. And they now have 300,000 users. It may be invented in America, or developed in America, but the internet is global, so anyone from India can also go. And in fact, I was told by the founder of 7 Cups that after the US, the second biggest user group is in India. So it's called 7 Cups.
Hi.
You can have a look at it. And that's another example of a technology.
Yes, sir. Hi, sir. Good evening. My name is Naresh. I have a daughter and a son in that order. My daughter is 24 and son is 19 plus. At the age of about 15, 4.5 years ago, he stopped talking to me. I don't know, all of a sudden. And we are a joint family. And in fact, he doesn't talk much to anybody in the family, except my brother, that is, and his mother, of course. And of late, I have come to know through my wife, he has kind of, confessed that he's suffering from anxiety and OCD, as you call it these days. Now, if he had been talking to me, maybe I would have guided him and, made some sense to him. But since he doesn't talk to me at all, even he doesn't want to see my face even. So I don't know how to go about it. If you could, throw some light on this.
Maybe I'll talk about that personal thing separately after this seminar. But I will say one thing on a more general note. Okay. It is not uncommon for adolescents to feel not very comfortable to talk to their parents about things that are troubling them. And I'll tell you, the reason is very obvious. If you remember that Snigdha Poonam's quotation, when the young man says, I don't want to tell my parents because they'll be disappointed. Because one of the aspirations that every young Indian has is that I want to impress my parents. And if there is anything that is going to feel that my parents are going to be disappointed, and having a mental health problem is a significant disappointment, or a fear of disappointment. It's probably as high as saying I'm gay. So that kind of fear of letting your parents down is one that stops a lot of people. That's why maybe he talks to your brother, because he doesn't have that same fear that he will be judged by him in the same way that he fears you might judge him. Even though you reassure him, even though everything you say to him, look, son, I'm your best friend. These are aspirations. These are aspirations that we all carry, part of our social milieu in this country.
So not telling me a problem is okay, but not talking to me at all, that I don't understand.
We'll talk about that.
Yes, sir. Last question.
My name is G.P. Bagai. I noticed in those maps you were showing that India is very dark, the largest place where you have suicides. I noticed that countries surrounding us like Pakistan and Bangladesh are much better off. Is it because they are poorer or they have lower aspirational status or what? That is one. And number two, in India now there are so many technical colleges, so many engineering colleges, and they're beginning to introduce humanities in the IITs. Now, at that level, would it help if they introduce psychology as a subject, yes, or is psychology supposed to be not dealing with mental health, but again another discipline? And would that help at that level? Thank you.
Yeah, the answer to your second question is very easy. Yes, absolutely. We need a heck of a lot more psychology training, but also we just need to see psychology as part of all our life skills. The idea that you can outsource psychology to psychologists is not necessarily the way I see the importance of psychology in our daily lives. Each of us should understand who we are. Each of us should have a basic set of of understanding and skills on managing our own mental health and managing the mental health of people near us. So to me, this is a fundamental life skill that should be taught to everyone, at least right now, starting in schools. The question about our neighbors, there is a very interesting, important influence on self-harm behavior, and that's religion. Both our neighbors that you pointed to are Islamic countries. And actually, suicide rates are the lowest in the world in Islamic countries. And I'm not a great scholar of Islamic, traditions on to do with suicide, but certainly Islamic countries have no alcohol. And alcohol is a very important factor that is important in understanding suicide behavior. But Islam also prohibits suicide. It's considered to be, it's not acceptable within the faith. So you will find very low suicide rates across all of North Africa, the Middle East, and all the way to Pakistan and Bangladesh.
Suicide. I thought that was a good thing.
No, decriminalization of suicide means it's not a law. It's not against the law of the land. But if you are Muslim, at least in a Muslim country, it's against the law of your faith, which is just probably more important. The other hotspot you might have seen is Russia. If you remember, Russia is because it's also going through catastrophic social change after the fall of communism and a catastrophic increase in alcoholism. And so Russia is one of the few countries in the world where life expectancy has fallen in the last 20 years, and it's fallen almost entirely due to suicide. But that's social change. The other thing I'll tell you, Bangladesh and Pakistan haven't seen the social change that India has. So there's been dramatic urbanization and, et cetera, all the things that are happening here, which haven't happened in those two countries.
So friends, we now come to the end of the session. Let me thank Dr. Vikram Patel on behalf of India International Center, on my own behalf, and on behalf of all of you for this wonderful, highly educative, highly erudite talk on this subject which affects Indian society at present in a big way. I hope all of us have taken good lesson from this talk, and I look forward to inviting Dr. Patel more and more to IISc for his talk. It was such a wonderful talk he delivered today. So with these few words, I once again thank him profusely. Thank you very much, Dr. Patel.
Thank you very much. And just for those of you who want to know more about Sangat's work, there's some brochures outside on your way out. Please feel free to pick them up. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks.